Alrighty, so we are recording now. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. And I want to welcome our presenter tonight, Nicole Evelina, author and historian, and tonight's program on women's suffrage in the land of Lincoln. All right, you want to go ahead?
Sure. I want to say thank you, first of all, to everybody who's here and everyone who will be watching this video in the future. I really appreciate having this opportunity to talk to you. I'm here today as someone who has a passion for preserving history, especially as it relates to the rights of women that we often take for granted. Um, the women's suffrage movement is my thing. Actually hoping soon, within the next couple of years, to get my PhD focusing on that. I'm in South Bend, Indiana, and I'm looking to get it from Notre Dame here. So hopefully that will happen. One disclaimer that I wanted to give before I get into the details of this presentation is that when I speak of women getting the right to vote in 1920, I'm referring to white women. Prior to the passage of the Snyder Act in 1924, Native American women weren't even considered citizens, much less voters. As late as 1962, some states still prevented them from voting through literacy tests, poll taxes, and claims that residence on a reservation meant one wasn't also a resident of the state. Asian American women were excluded from voting until the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1952. And it wasn't until the passage of the 1965 Voting Rights Act that all Black people were granted the full right to vote. Over the next hour, we are going to learn how women gained the right to vote in Illinois by looking at the lives of 12 women and one man who were critical in making this historical event come to pass. In order to do that, I have to take you back to 1818, the year the Illinois State Constitution extended citizenship to all white men over the age of 21 years. 30 years later, the second Illinois State Constitution still denied suffrage to women and Black men. It was not until the third Illinois State Constitution in 1870 that suffrage was extended to Black men. Women's suffrage was first brought before the Illinois government in 1891. As we all know, that effort failed, as did bills introduced in 1893, 1895, 1897, 1901, 1903, 1905, 1907, and 1909. So it certainly wasn't for lack of trying. In 1913, the Illinois legislature voted on Senate Bill 63 to grant women aged 21 and older full presidential and municipal suffrage and partial state and county suffrage. The vote in the Senate was 29 to 15 in favor of passage. In the House, the successful vote was 83 to 58. In total, women fought for nearly 65 years to be enfranchised in Illinois. There is a handout that goes along with this presentation. Hopefully you guys will have that available to you that gives you more of a detailed timeline than I'm going to go into tonight. We're going to have more of an overview. The state of Illinois in 2020 made a special website that recognizes 15 suffragists that were crucial to the state, but I can't cover all of them in an hour, so I'm going to give you a few here that deserve an honorable mention. Prudence Crandall, who was a teacher and early advocate of enfranchisement of both Black and white women as early as 1833. Margaret Haley, who believed women needed the right to vote because teachers could not teach their students how to exercise their democratic rights unless they themselves had the right to vote. Kate O'Connor, who fought to secure labor rights for women and children across the Midwest. Agnes Nestor, who saw women's suffrage as directly tied to working women's interests. She argued that women needed the vote to strengthen their fight for safe conditions and fair treatment under the law. And Lucy Flower, the first woman in Illinois to be elected by voters statewide in 1894. Before we get into the featured women that we're going to talk about, I want to give you just a slight bit of background for those who are not familiar with the women's suffrage movement in the United States. Many of its members were abolitionists before taking up the cause of women's suffrage, and abolition actually functioned as a training ground for these women in organization, politics, speaking, and finances. In 1848, the Seneca Falls Convention happened, which is considered the moment that the suffrage movement and modern feminism in the United States were founded. Had the Civil War not happened, women may have gotten the right to vote a lot sooner because things were actually moving in that direction, but then the war required all of everyone's attention naturally. After the Civil War, there were actually two women's suffrage organizations in the United States. There was the National Women's Suffrage Association, which was headed by Susan B. Anthony. It's the one that you've probably heard the most about. They were the most vocal, the most, I guess, radical is the word, although they weren't violent like the radicals in England were. They also favored a national solution to women's suffrage. The other group was the American Women's Suffrage Association. They didn't like the more outspoken tactics of the National Women's Suffrage Association. They believed more in letter writing campaigns and quieter, more genteel forms of protest. They were headed by Lucy Stone. Now, eventually, in the 1890s, the two organizations did merge into the National American Women's Suffrage Association. And believe me, there will not be a test on all of the names. They can get quite confusing. Anyway, Illinois ended up siding with the National Women's Suffrage Association in 1876. So the first woman we are going to talk about is Susie Hoxie Richardson. Unfortunately, we don't have any photos of her, or at least not that I could find. She was a cousin of Susan B. Anthony. She was the organizer of Illinois' first women's suffrage society in 1855 in Earlville, Illinois, the Earlville Suffrage Association. She founded it in her home, which most women's suffrage organizations were founded that way. She had heard of the women's suffrage movement through a speech given by Alonzo Jackson Grover. He, in 1870, became the editor of the Earlville Transcript and included women's rights activist Catherine Van Valkenburg Waite's article on political rights for women in the newspaper, which marked the first written publication supporting women's suffrage in Illinois. His wife, Octavia Grover, actually became the secretary of the Earlville Suffrage Association. The next woman that we're going to talk about is Mary Livermore. She was important for starting Illinois' first statewide women's suffrage association. Prior to the Civil War, she was an abolitionist and actually was opposed to women's suffrage. But during the war, she was appointed co-director, along with a woman named Jane Hogue, of the Northwestern branch of the Sanitary Commission, a relief agency which provided supplies to soldiers and operated battlefield hospitals. During the war, Mary became, and this is an exact quote, aware that a large portion of the nation's work was badly done or not done at all because woman was not recognized as a factor in the political world. This convinced her that, quote, men and women should stand shoulder to shoulder, equal before the law, end quote, and that suffrage was the way for the enactment of social reforms that she felt were needed. In 1869, she began a women's suffrage newspaper called The Agitator. She organized a women's suffrage convention in Chicago, and during that convention created the Illinois Women's Suffrage Association. Speakers at that convention included Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. There was another woman named Naomi Talbert Anderson who spoke about the need to include Black women in the conversation about women's suffrage. On the same day, there was another suffrage convention held a block away by another women's organization. The Chicago Tribune reported that women obviously didn't have the capacity to govern, since they couldn't even agree on planning a common convention. The paper predicted that, quote, the public will now be annoyed for 6 months by the characteristic ill humor of a lot of old hens trying to hatch out their addled productions. not exactly supportive. In 1870, the Agitator merged with the Woman's Journal, which was published in Boston. At that time, Mary and her husband moved to Massachusetts, where she continued to work for social reform and women's issues until her death in 1905. Next, we have Frances Willard, who was Illinois' most famous reformer of this period and was the first woman ever to address an official session of the Illinois General Assembly. Her key contribution was linking the temperance and suffrage movements. In February 1870, Frances Willard and the Illinois Women's Suffrage Association petitioned the Illinois Constitutional Convention to include women's suffrage in the state constitution. That same year, a popular movement was called home protection. It said that women were benevolent influences on the home and the family and should be given voting rights on issues pertaining to the home, such as school board elections and liquor licenses. Frances's argument was that women should have the ability to act in protection of their home, and that this was part of their traditional role, not outside of it. And she also said that women's voting was the only way to get rid of the demon spirits that were running the American family. And by spirits, she meant alcohol. 4 years later, in 1874, she became totally immersed in the temperance movement that was sweeping the country. If you've heard her name, that is probably why. She helped establish the anti-liquor group, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, or WCTU, and eventually served as president of the Chicago state and national organizations. In 1879, there was a petition sent to the General Assembly for women to have suffrage rights over alcohol-related issues in Illinois. That was unsuccessful. But under Willard's leadership, the WCTU grew to be the largest organization of women by 1890. Through this, she brought the WTCU members into the suffrage movement. We're going to talk now briefly about Alta Hewitt, Myra Colby Bradwell, and her husband, Judge James Bradwell, and the influences that the judicial branch actually had on the movement in Illinois. So obviously, the right to vote was not the only right that women needed. There were related issues that needed to be handled legally, and these three people were instrumental in getting laws passed that gave women more rights. 1860 and 1890, there were laws passed to where women could control their own earnings for the first time. They were given equal guardianship of children after divorce, because previously the children actually went to the husband, which is kind of opposite of what we think of today. And they were also given the right to control and maintain property, to share in their deceased husband's estate, and to enter any occupation or profession. Alta Hewitt actually became Illinois' first female attorney. In 1873, Judge Bradwell secured the passage of a statute which allowed any woman, married or single, which is very important, things used to only apply to married women, who possessed the qualifications required of men to be eligible for any school office in Illinois created by law and not the Constitution. In November 1874, even though women couldn't vote for themselves, 10 women were elected as county superintendents of schools. In 1888, the Women's Decatur Suffrage Club was formed by Sophie Gibb and 100 other women in Decatur, Illinois. Shortly thereafter, the Naperville Equal Suffrage Club was created. In 1898, just a year later, women's suffrage clubs lobbied for women to be exempt from taxation since they did not vote, an idea that was first conceived by Virginia Minor in 1869. They basically said it was taxation without representation. Therefore, if they weren't given the ability to vote, they would withhold their very valuable tax money from the state. That actually happened across the country, and it was successful to an extent. It was very devastating for a lot of women, but they were willing to give up their property, give up their rights, and in some cases, even their homes, in order to say just how clearly they wanted the right to vote. Ellen Martin, sorry, who is our next woman, is recognized as the first woman to vote in the state of Illinois. She was actually a lawyer from Lombard. Many Illinois towns had special charters of incorporation written into law just before the 1870 state contribution forbid what they called private laws. While these charters specifically gave the vote only to men, Lombard's copy, and we don't know if she knew this or not, actually stated that all citizens above the age of 21 who were registered shall be entitled to vote in municipal elections. As soon as she noticed this, she knew what she had to do. On April 6, 1891, she went to her polling place with a large law book and 14 other prominent female citizens. When they demanded their right to vote, allegedly, the judges were so flabbergasted that one was taken with a spasm and another, according to the newspaper, fell backward into a flour barrel. I don't know about you, but I would have loved to have seen that. Eventually, the judges ruled in her favor, and she and the other women were the first 15 female votes cast in Illinois, and they were tabulated. She also worked for women's suffrage at the national and local level. In 1892, she was elected chairman of the Women Voters of Lombard. In 1894, she founded the Chicago Political Equality League specifically to work for women's full political equality. Our next important woman is Catherine Waugh McCulloch. She was remembered for being a legal advisor and for devising a bill that would many years later allow women partial suffrage in Illinois for the first time. She was one of the first 100 women lawyers in the country, and for more than 40 years was instrumental in documenting the legislative victories of other states and internationally. She was a legal advisor to the National Women's Christian Temperance Union and the National Women's Suffrage Association. And she was a busy woman in addition to that. Over the course of her life, she was elected an officer of the following organizations: the Illinois Equal Suffrage Association, a role that she held for 22 years, the National Women's Suffrage Association, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the Chicago Women's Club, the Chicago Political Equality League, the Women's Bar Association of Illinois, and the League of Women Voters. She actually devised a strategy that would allow women to vote for president and in other elections that were not constitutionally limited to men. Her bill was introduced in 1893, but it took another 20 years for it to pass in 1913. And now we're going to talk about Fannie Barrier Williams. She was one of the earliest champions of Black women's suffrage in the state. She grew up in Brockport, New York, and her family was one of the few successful Black families in the area. Her father was a businessman, and because of the, what's the word I'm looking for? Because of the advantages, there we go, my brain kicked in, that gave her, she was the first Black graduate of the Teacher Training College of Brockport State Normal School, which is now SUNY Brockport. She reported experiencing very little racism until she left New York to teach at schools for freedmen in Hannibal, Missouri. In the 1880s, she was active in the Illinois Women's Alliance, an interracial labor and reform organization. And she also contributed to the Hyde Park Voters Republican Club. In 1895, she was the only Black member of the Chicago Women's Club. This was important because by allowing an African American woman into the club, it created an opportunity for minority women's issues to be heard as well. She helped fund the National League of Colored Women, one of several organizations she would found throughout her life. Another in 1896 was the National Association of Colored Women. One of the most well-known and most trusted Black lecturers at the time, she shared the podium with Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, which was a very rare occurrence. At the Illinois Women's League, Fanny gave lectures on the importance of suffrage for Black women. In 1909, she helped create the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, also known as the NAACP, which I'm sure many of you have heard of. Fanny was so influential that in 1907, she was the only Black woman asked to speak at Susan B. Anthony's funeral. Grace Wilbur Trout, another influential Illinois woman, was known for her unusual and groundbreaking tactics. She joined the Chicago Political Equality League in 1894. In 1910, she was elected president of the Chicago Political Equality League. And she enlisted the support of prominent men, including Chicago Mayor Fred Busey and John Farrison of Oak Park, to the cause of suffrage. And to get attention, she organized a suffrage float in the same 4th of July parade. In July 1910, she also organized auto tours throughout several suburbs, giving an opening speech at each stop. 4 women speakers were accompanied by 2 reporters, and they visited 16 towns in northern Illinois counties in 5 days. In 1912, she was unanimously elected president of the statewide Illinois Equal Suffrage Association. In that role, she was known for avoiding confrontation and instead conducted a quiet educational campaign aimed at building support for suffrage, especially a partial suffrage bill. In 1913, she led the Illinois delegation at the suffrage march in Washington, D.C. And that march was pivotal because it gave very strong, very clear national attention to the issue of women's suffrage and just how badly women wanted it and how strongly they were campaigning for it. Grace was asked by organizers to ask the Black contingent that was led by Ida B. Wells, who we'll talk about here in a moment, to walk at the end of the march rather than with the Illinois designation so as not to offend the Southern women. And she did as she was asked. We don't know if she agreed with it or not, but she is considered a controversial figure because she had the courage, I guess that's the word, or the gall, depending on how you looked at it, to go up to Ida B. Wells and actually speak to her about the issue of race. On May 7th, 1913, a partial suffrage bill was passed in the Illinois Senate, but it was held up in the House by anti-suffrage lobbyists. Speaker of the House, William McKinley, told her that he would only bring it up for the final vote if he could be convinced that all the people of the state actually wanted it. So Grace spearheaded a telephone calling system that resulted in a flood of telegrams, letters, and telephone calls to the Speaker of the House, Mr. McKinley. He received a phone call reportedly every 15 minutes, day and night. So he got the message and finally scheduled the vote. Beforehand, Grace literally counted heads and fetched needed men from their residences to make sure that the vote would pass. She also guarded the door to the House chambers and urged members in favor not to leave before the vote, while trying also to prevent the anti-lobbyists from illegally being allowed onto the House floor. Her efforts were not in vain, and the bill passed. Governor Edward F. Dunn signed it on June 26, 1913, while she and 2 other women looked on. After this victory, she turned her attention to preventing the bill from being overturned. In 1915, she actually became very weary of the infighting among the Illinois suffrage groups and retired to Jacksonville, Florida. But she wasn't gone for long, which most of these women couldn't stay out of the movement even if they wanted to. In 1916, she returned to Chicago to work with the National Women's Suffrage Association leaders in a campaign to include women's suffrage on the plank at the Republican National Convention's party platform. As the party's executive committee debated, some 5,000 women marched on Michigan Avenue in the soaking rain. They succeeded, and the Republican Party included women's suffrage in its platform. For the next 3 years, 1917 to 1919, she served on the lobbying committee of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, and in late 1919 was reelected president of the Illinois Equal Suffrage Association for the seventh and last time. In February 1920, she oversaw the National American Women's Suffrage Association's last convention. When the Illinois Equal Suffrage Association was formed as the Illinois League of Women Voters, she was among the first 3 signers of its Articles of Incorporation. And just in case anyone doesn't know, the League of Women Voters is still very active today. It exists in every state in the country. It exists on a national level as well. So if you hear about it over and over again, which I'm pretty sure you will tonight, and if you're interested, they still exist and are happily still accepting volunteers. And our next woman is Jane Addams, who is probably one of the most well-known members of the Illinois women's suffrage movement. And you've probably heard her name because she co-founded Hull House in 1889, whose main purpose was to provide social and educational opportunities for working class people, many of whom were recent European immigrants in the surrounding neighborhoods. Jane is an interesting figure when you look at her journey to the women's suffrage movement. In college, she is known to have said she believed in the cause of women's suffrage simply because her father did, which, not unusual. A lot of us look up to our fathers. In her 20s and 30s, she considered herself a suffragist, but took no interest in the cause of women voting. She took her first reluctant step into politics in 1893 when her friends persuaded her to lobby for proposed child labor legislation that was then moving through the Illinois legislature. In 1895, she realized that to achieve her goal at the time, which was to clean up city politics, working class women needed to have credibility in the eyes of men, and the vote was the way to do that. So she gave her first suffrage speech in 1897 at a reception of the Massachusetts Women's Suffrage Association. By this time, she was a prominent national figure, both because Hull House was famous and successful, and because of her own lecturing around the country and her writings in national publications. In 1906, she finally embraced the suffrage movement fully. The National Women's Suffrage Association included working women in its efforts. So she took to the lecture circuit to speak for women's suffrage, specifically to these groups. Over the next 7 years, though she never stopped pushing for other reforms, Jane put her heart and soul into winning women the vote. She traveled thousands of miles from California to New York and addressed every sort of audience. Her speeches and essays on suffrage circulated widely in pamphlets, newspapers, magazines, and also the Ladies' Home Journal, which I'm pretty sure you've probably heard of. In 1911, the Illinois Equal Suffrage Association organized a public campaign to get a state suffrage bill into law. They rented a special train to bring hundreds of women from 40 women's organizations across Illinois from Chicago to Springfield. They were greeted by large crowds at each depot, and the women took turns on the rear platform making their case for the vote. The Joliet News called them the conquering heroines. Also that same year, Jane was named to the National American Women's Suffrage Association board as vice president and began attending monthly meetings in New York City when she could. The Women's Trade Union League, of which she was a co-founder, added suffrage to its platform in 1911 and was now closely cooperating with the National American Women's Suffrage Association. They, in turn, added equal pay for equal work and industrial safety to their platform. In 1912, Jane was named to the National Progressive Party Committee and campaigned for Theodore Roosevelt, who was running for a third term. Huge crowds, mostly men, turned out to hear her speak. She wrote to her sister afterwards, "I had the best chance to talk women's suffrage that I ever had in my life. I talked it to vast audiences of men. They would not have come to a suffrage meeting or a social reform meeting, but they would have come to a political meeting, and there they had it driven into them night after night, day after day." And even though Roosevelt lost to Wilson, he was, unfortunately, Wilson was no friend of the movement, but Jane did not let that stop her. In 1916, she became the first woman to have her national political endorsement be sought by either party, let alone both. Republican Charles Evans Hughes sent Theodore Roosevelt as his emissary to seek Jane's endorsement. President Woodrow Wilson sent her a huge bouquet of roses. She ended up backing Wilson. And she rose further in national politics than any other woman in history. In Illinois, chances are good you've heard of Ida B. Wells Barnett. There is a street named after her, among many other things in the state, in Chicago, actually. She became famous in 1884 when she was forcibly removed from a train car because of her race. She sued the railroad for infringement of her rights. She initially won the case, although it was later overturned on appeal. She wrote about the incident in a local newspaper and subsequently began writing on race issues for national and local newspapers. In the early 1900s, she became involved in the suffrage movement. She believed that voting was an essential way for the Black community to overcome discrimination and oppression, writing in 1910 that, "With no sacredness of the ballot, there can be no sacredness of human life itself." In January 1913, she founded the Alpha Suffrage Club, the first such organization for Black women in Illinois. March 3rd of that year, she took part in the Washington, D.C. suffrage parade that I referenced earlier. She tried to line up with the rest of her Illinois sisters, but was asked to go to the end of the line with the other Black suffragists so as not to offend and alienate the Southern women, as I mentioned before. She feigned agreement, but then joined the Illinois delegation once the parade was started. And she said, "I am not taking this stand because I personally wish for recognition. I am doing it for the future benefit of my whole race." Just a few months later, in June, once Illinois law allowed women to vote for some offices, the Alpha Suffrage Club went door to door in the 2nd, 14th, 30th, and 6th wards, urging women to register as voters and show up at the polls. Ida and her club visited female inmates in the Bridewell prison, becoming the first group to ever hold a suffrage meeting there. In June 1916, she joined the women who marched in Chicago to the Republican National Convention Hall in the rain that we talked about just a minute ago. And when the 19th Amendment was ratified in 1920, the Alpha Suffrage Club became part of the Illinois League of Women Voters. So how exactly did ratification of the 19th Amendment happen in Illinois? Well, on June 4th, 1919, the Senate passed the Susan B. Anthony Amendment, which is what it was called at the time, and the race to ratification began. The legislatures of 36 states would have to ratify the amendment within the next year or so. Illinois hoped to be the first state to ratify it. On June 10th, 1919, Illinois lawmakers believed they had achieved that goal when ratification passed unanimously in the Illinois Senate with only 3 votes opposed in the House. However, in their zeal to be first, the legislature inadvertently voted to approve the wrong language. Once the error was discovered, another vote was taken, 7 days later on June 17th. So while Illinois was first in terms of time, Wisconsin was legally the first to vote, and Illinois was the seventh. So Illinois was sort of first. Chicago was the birthplace of the National League of Women Voters, although that title is contested by the St. Louis League to this day. St. Louis and Chicago have kind of always had that beef going on way longer than before the Cards and Cubs were rivals. The controversy started the last week of March 1919 at the Statler Hotel in St. Louis as the 50th anniversary convention of the National American Women's Suffrage Association was in place. There, Carrie Chapman Catt called for, quote, a league of women voters to finish the fight and aid in the reconstruction of the nation, which she saw as a memorial to all of the suffrage pioneers. October of that year, the League of Women Voters of Missouri was founded, and November 13th, 1919, the St. Louis League was founded. The next year, on February 14th, 1920, at the Pitt Congress Hotel in Chicago, 6 months before the 19th Amendment was ratified, the National League of Women Voters was formed. Present at the creation were three suffragists that we've talked about today: Jane Addams, Ida Wells Barnett, Catherine Waugh McCullough, and Grace Wilbur Trout. So they actually got to see the end of the fight that they dedicated their lives to. And that actually is the end of the presentation. It actually went by faster than I expected it to, but that gives us 20 minutes for questions and any additional information that you guys would like to know. So I actually will hold this screen up there a little bit. It has my contact information on it. If you think of anything later, or if you don't want to ask questions now, or if you're someone watching the video in the future, feel free to get in touch with me, ask me any questions that you want to. I'm available pretty much anywhere, and I absolutely love this subject, so I'd be more than happy to speak with you. Does anyone have questions? Did I bore you with all of the dates and numbers and names? Hopefully not. Okay.
All right. I just want to jump in real quick, as if people are thinking of questions. Just wanted to say thank you again so much. And a
Yeah.
recording of this presentation will be available. So anybody listening today, you're welcome to share that. That'll be available soon on our YouTube channel. And you also mentioned a handout that will be available. I'll send that out to all of the attendees who are registered for this event, but I'll also have printout copies available here at the library. And I also wanted to mention that Nicole's books are available through our library. Give us a call or check in with us if you want any help getting a hold of those. And I did want to highlight that your book, America's Forgotten Suffragettes, is also available and ties in perfectly.
And that is about Virginia and Frances Minor. I did mention Virginia very briefly as the person who came up with the idea of women not voting or not paying their taxes because they were not equally represented with voting. And she's where it came from. They're both from St. Louis, so lived a long time in St. Louis, and so have a lot of ties to the Illinois area. Anybody have any other questions or anything? Okay. Well, I want to say thank you again. I enjoyed it.